We are back once again with Erika Brown, the publisher and editor of The Cricket. She's in her office in downtown Manchester by the Sea to share all things Manchester and Essex with us. How are you, Erika?
Kory, I missed you. I missed you.
It's been a while, I know. Wait, there was just 1 week?
It was, but it felt
A
like
long,
longer.
it was a long week, but we're back now. Back from safari, apparently. And here with you again.
Back from safari and for you in Colorado. I was in the safari of Cape Ann. I didn't
Yeah.
go anywhere.
Well, that's Erika. So we just briefly before we went on air, we're chatting about all the things going on in Manchester and Essex lately. It's crazy. Let's get right to it. There's some heavy hitting stuff here. First off, the PFAS class action.
Yeah, we wrote about this. It's funny. Typically, the summertime is sort of the kind of a little bit of a down, right, for all the municipalities, and they kind of start to warm up a little bit around now to tee up things to really hit it in September. This summer has been really packed, and the PFAS class action is something that it didn't happen this summer. It actually has been happening for a while, but we did a real deep dive into it because it's really interesting. The PFAS, of course, is the forever chemicals that are in our water supply. And what really happened to kind of trigger our attention around this is that we had, I don't know if you remember, we've been talking about this for a while because I've been covering water really closely, but the EPA had a PFAS, and I'm just going to do this as a quick setup because it's kind of what is interesting about these class actions. And the class actions are in 3 local towns are participating: Essex, Manchester, Hamilton. So keep that in mind. And I think nearly every municipality is considering this across the Commonwealth. So it's actually quite important. Up until March, this is what we lived in a world where the federal government, the EPA, the US EPA, Environmental Protection Agency, had a standard of 70 parts per trillion. What does that mean? It's like a grain of sand in a swimming pool. Like it's teeny, teeny, teeny for these chemicals. And there are a lot of them. And they're all these forever chemicals that are associated with illness and toxicity. They're just not good to be. And they come from things like firefighting foam. Oddly, by the way, firefighting foam that was created in, I think, the 40s or 50s in partnership with the US military. Mm-hmm. So, and now the government's going, no, we can't have it, but anyway, so firefighting foam at things like military bases and airports, non-stick cookware coating, and then also things like anything waterproof in materials, in textiles, think carpets, furniture, and then also wicking clothing. Any kind of high performance outdoor clothing that has waterproof things, for rain and wicking moisture. So it's everywhere. Okay, so 70 parts per trillion, right? Massachusetts was like, yeah, we're not doing the 70 parts. We're going to do 20. Right. We're going to be hard. We're going to be stringent. So we've been living with this 20 parts per trillion thing. In March, the EPA lowered it to, do you remember we talked about this? 4.
I do, yeah.
Four from 70. So suddenly all these towns like Manchester has consistently, in one of our wells, it has consistently tested. And I know this is a wide range, but when testing is new, it can be all over the place with the labs. It tested between 10 and 20. So we thought, okay, we're fine. In the other one, it was always consistent. Gravelly Pond, always consistently below 10. So Manchester thinks, okay, we're doing okay. Well, guess what? And by the way, as a side note, Hyannis, Massachusetts, and down the Cape, keep this in mind. They're the 3rd largest PFAS concentration and poisoning, public water poisoning, in the country. Ooh. Yeah, in the country. So, and then no other towns in Massachusetts are in that top 50 in the country, at least not for now. So don't worry. But Hyannis is kind of really weird. So I just wanted to provide that in context. So here we are now. We've got 4. So now all these towns are looking at having to mitigate for PFAS that when they were thinking they were okay, but they're not. Manchester is looking at a $25 million plan to mitigate for PFAS. It's a very good plan. They're going to redirect the water from one well to their water treatment plant with piping systems. And then what you have to do is you have to install these kind of industrial grade carbon filters. Think about the carbon filters that are in your refrigerator.
Right.
Water filter. By the way, keep those up to date, by the way. Never let them lapse because they're actually quite effective. But we've got to do the same equivalent to our municipal water system, and so does probably most other towns that have any sort of issue, anything over 4. So back to the class action. Manchester has signed up for a class action lawsuit, which is class actions. I don't know if you realize the history of class actions are. It was innovative 30 years ago or 30 years ago when Scott Harshbarger, I don't know if you remember that name.
Oh, I do remember that. Yeah.
Yeah, he was a young attorney general for the state of Massachusetts, and he was one of the first, if not the first, state attorney general to sue, in this case, tobacco. He sued Big Tobacco to reclaim the taxpayer dollars that were spent on healthcare for the the cancers associated with smoking. That was the first time anybody had ever thought of that. And so now it's become kind of standard for attorneys general from states to bring a state into a class action for the same thing. Think about like sugary drinks, they do it, like these kinds of things. I was stunned to see municipalities. What does a law firm in New York City care about a 5,500 person town like Manchester or a 3,600 person town? For them to collect those litigants are very interesting. Well, guess what? Maura Healey signed up for it when she was the attorney general before she was governor. So this is a massive lawsuit. There are 4,600 lawsuits related to PFAS across the country now. And 6 years ago, there were 40.
Ooh, wow.
Yes. So these are existential crises for the companies associated with, like 3M in Minnesota. Yeah. They make the firefighting foam and then other things. Guess what? They're saying that they won't even survive this lawsuit. As a corporation, they've been around for over 100 years. So, and they're the ones who worked with the federal government to develop the foam in the first place. So I find it just really interesting. It's very interesting. But how else are these towns going to reclaim these mitigation costs? And that's really what they're looking at. So there you go. I probably spent too much time talking about that, but I find it really interesting. By the way, also, we class actions, think about, people think of Erin Brockovich. They forget about Jan Schlickman, who lives in Beverly, the lawyer who did a civil action, which was the first of its kind to try to look at groundwater poisoning, allegedly. I always have to put the allegedly, for groundwater that was connected to a cancer bloom in Woburn, Massachusetts. So we have a very local history to this whole concept of water safety, chemicals, class actions. That we have, Massachusetts is pretty darned interesting. So
yeah, no, and we appreciate the context too. It's very helpful and necessary. All right, next big topic, FinCom.
Oh yeah, we're back with the FinCom. I'll keep this pretty short. The FinCom, remember 3 weeks ago, we were talking about the fact that they had introduced this new math. They would introduce new math for savings.
Fuzzy math.
Usually math, well, it's not fuzzy. It was basically like, kind of consider it like a game of Jenga, right? It's like a game of Jenga. You got the whole tower and you're kind of trying to pull out rods underneath. Well, they were trying to pull out 50% of the town's budget, right? Say it's $34 million. About 50% goes to the school district, right? Mm-hmm. Our assessment. And they had this kind of new logic that said, wait a minute, we can still have a 10% savings rate if we remove 50% of our thing and then just do the 10% on 50% of the base, right? Remove the school allotment for our district. And the logic there is, well, the school district has its own reserves, so why should we be double paying for reserves? That was basically their logic. The problem with that logic is nobody else does it, and it's not really a best practice. They learned that this week or last week from their auditors and from I think there's an association called like the Government Financial Managers Association. They also gave like their best practices, and they basically said one of two things, which we'd already covered a couple weeks ago, and we talked about it. That's not a best practice. Do not remove the thing. And so they kind of acquiesced to that and said, well, okay. So all of a sudden, just for context, their math would have taken Manchester's reserve rate, which is the audited state, savings account for the town, right? And it's two flavors of it, but it's it. The recommended thing is that you have 2 months of savings, 2 months of your expenses, which is about 16% of your expenses. So your reserve rate should be at about 16% was the recommendation, right? Or the best practice. They also said as a best practice, don't remove the Don't do 16% on 50% of the number, right? So don't remove your school thing, right? So they acquiesced on the school thing. So their old math would have taken it from about 15.8%, so about 16%, which is our current basically reserve rate, and reduced it down to 5%. They didn't do the math, we did it, but it would have been about 5 point something percent. So 2/3, like a big drop. Now, what they're going to recommend to the select board is that they're reinstalling the school allotment, but they still want it to go down to about 10% of the whole. So they want to really go, they're recommending going from 16 to 10%. They think they can still retain a AAA bond rating with that. They have to bring it to the select board. The select board's going to consider it, but that is kind of a big change. And I think what they're doing is they're falling in line with best practices. I think that's the headline. So there you go. And then connected to that, and I'll just really quickly, is what we talked about is, we talked about, sorry, my phone just went off. But we talked about actual expenditures. And that's, I think, the most interesting thing, because the finance committee, at the same time that they're looking at reducing their savings rate because they want to put money back in taxpayer pockets, which is, you know, a fine motivation, we're also looking at unprecedented expenditures that are on the books for the next 30 years. You know, you got the DPW is telling the FinCom just 2 weeks ago that there are about, if you add in the Essex Elementary School, it's like hundreds of millions of dollars. It's like $200 million is what Maury Creighton of the Finance Committee calculated right in the Finance Committee meeting. He goes, wait a minute, if you add in the Essex Elementary School, that's about $200 million of obligations over the next 30 years. So we'll see. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm actually going to calculate the difference of what it would cost to borrow, to float a bond, right, for $100 million at if you were a AAA bond rating or a AA plus bond rating, which is where Manchester was 12 years ago when it last had low reserves. So stay tuned for that.
Yeah. Good stuff, Erika. Okay, and lastly, we have a bevy of public hearings coming up.
Yeah, I would just say that, and the one that's the most important, and I've actually I was trying to fish it out in the beginning. In September, we're going to start public hearings. Self-signaling is going to kick up with the planning board. That'll take 6 months. And I think it's going to be around September. They haven't like set a date, but it's going to start. That's going to behave like the 40B hearings for the ZBA, where we had like, they get peer reviewed on all things from traffic impact to environmental impact to financial impact. Because the cell signaling up in the limited commercial district is going to be huge. It's going to be a big change. It's also going to have a huge positive financial impact. So that's a good thing. That's the biotech company from Danvers. They're going to move in. The second big thing though, and that's actually happening, is the public hearing in September on Tux Point, the rotunda. And that's actually getting a lot of attention because there's 3 options that the town is considering. And one of them, I'm actually looking for the actual date itself. It's going to be on September, I think it's the 14th or the 18th, something like that. Yep, September 14th at 6:30. Sorry, I needed to get that right. September 14th, they're going to hear sort of a public hearing, and then they're going to make a decision the following Monday. So they're actually going to make a decision on this. This is actually real. And they're going to decide the iconic rotunda needs to be revamped. They're either going to renovate it as is, which is a certain price, renovate it plus raising it or extending it out, which is another price, or bring it out on land, which is the cheapest price and also the most controversial, because Tux Point, the rotunda. And then the final one is to do it exactly as is, but do it in 2 parts, which ironically is the most expensive. Isn't that interesting? They're going to do it in they could do it in 2 parts, but it'd be like 5.6 million, as opposed to the lowest cost is like 1.7 million for bringing it up on land. And then everything else is somewhere in between. So there you go. That's it.
Lots MBTA as well, right? For public hearing?
Yeah, MBTA is going, no, the MBTA doesn't have a public hearing, but they're going to start there. Those are all public. Those are going to start in September, and they're going to start and kick into high gear, being bi-weekly in September. Every other week, it's going to be a joint meeting with the planning board. That's kind of really important because they're under the gun to bring this to town meeting next spring. So and they're going to bring it to next spring. So they're going to start to really get into this deeply, and Jeff Pope is going to start covering that really closely.
Gotcha. Folks, get the cricket. Erika, awesome stuff as always. There's a lot to unpack here, so We appreciate your time and your efforts as always. We'll see you next week.
Oh my God, bye.
Interested in a sponsorship? Email sponsor@1623studios.org to learn more.